What bothered me most here wasn't just that Pete Hegseth avoided the questions, it's how carefully Chris Murphy built them so there was almost nowhere to hide. We're talking about Trump, taxpayer money, and a Qatar jet, and the answers only raised more questions. Stay with me, because after this exchange, I want to show you exactly why I think every American should care about what happened here.
Let me ask you one more question. This is a request for supplemental funding because you don't have the funding in your base budget to do what you need to do, which makes questions about the base budget relevant. There's been a lot of attention, Mr. Secretary, on the modernization of a luxury jet that was gifted to the president by the government of Qatar. Reports suggest that maybe as much as $1 billion in your base funding, an extraordinary amount of money, has been used for an upgrade, and the plane is back in the shop for a second upgrade. As far as I can tell, never before has an administration not made public the amount of money for an upgrade or a construction contract on a presidential airplane. Obviously, we don't need or want disclose the details of that upgrade, but never before have you withheld from Congress and the public the total amount of money. I think there are two really important questions here. One, will you make public the amount of money that you are spending to upgrade this plane? And two, can you commit to this Congress and this committee that the president isn't going to take this plane with him when he leaves office? The only thing more insulting to the taxpayers of spending money on a jet they don't need would be for the president to take it with him, to take it out of our military inventory when he leaves office.
Say the Air Force has done an incredible job making that a capable jet that ultimately, but its capabilities and investment are classified and shouldn't be talked about in a public setting.
That's not what I'm asking.
Considering
Will
the
you make
security of the
amount
President of the
money?
United States.
Will you disclose the amount of money publicly?
I would imagine as part of the regular budget process, that's something that we would look at.
And will you commit that the president will not take
But you have
this
to look
jet?
at the classification level of certain things that are not devolved for reasons of national security.
Will you commit that the president will not take this jet with him out of federal inventory when he leaves office?
That's not a decision for necessarily me to make, and ultimately we're grateful to have it in the fleet for the Air Force to protect the President of the United States.
That's a deeply
Senator
unsatisfactory
Peters.
answer to the American public.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Folks, welcome to the hearing today.
Start with a fact, not a fight. At a Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee hearing on the Pentagon's budget, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut asked Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth a question that, on paper, should not have been difficult to answer. Murphy wanted to know whether the administration would make public the amount of money being spent to convert a Boeing 747 gifted to President Trump by the government of Qatar into a functioning Air Force One. That's the question, not classified engineering, not defensive countermeasures, not the technical specifications that keep a president safe in the air, just a number, or at least a commitment to eventually disclose one. Hegseth is not a mid-level Pentagon staffer. He is the Secretary of Defense, one of the most consequential positions in the Trump administration, responsible for a budget measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. When a person in that position is asked a basic financial oversight question by a sitting senator on the Appropriations Committee, the committee that authorizes the money he spends, the expectation is a straight answer, or a straight explanation of why one isn't available yet. Instead, Hegseth's response leaned on classification. The investment, he said, was classified information that couldn't be discussed in that setting. Here's where the analysis has to slow down and separate two things that sound similar but are not the same. There is a real category of military information that must stay secret: vulnerabilities, defensive systems, the technical guts of how a president is protected in flight. Nobody serious argues the public needs access to that. But the sticker price of a taxpayer-funded modification program is not, by itself, the same category of secret. Governments disclose program costs sometimes in ranges, sometimes with redactions without compromising the systems themselves. It has been done before, including with the standard VC-25B replacement program, which the previous Trump administration itself publicized in a press release. That history matters here. It undercuts the idea that cost secrecy is simply how these programs work. Murphy's response captured the disconnect in a single line. That isn't what I'm asking. There are two possible readings of what happened next. One is that Hegseth genuinely conflated a spending question with a security question, an understandable but troubling gap in preparation for a hearing everyone knew was coming. The other is that he recognized the question was answerable but politically uncomfortable, and reached for the safest available response. This script isn't going to declare which explanation is correct. Both are worth sitting with. What's not really in dispute is the pattern. When a cabinet secretary can't or won't draw a clean line between legitimate secrecy and basic financial accountability, oversight starts to lose its function. If classified can be invoked any time a number might embarrass the administration, the word stops doing its actual job. That's block one. Not outrage, just the shape of the problem. Murphy didn't let it go, and that's worth sitting with before moving forward. When Hegseth repeated the classification answer, Murphy pushed back directly. That's not what I'm talking about. It's a small moment on video, but it's the emotional center of this exchange, a senator restating, almost patiently, that he is not asking for the thing the witness keeps declining to give him. To be fair to Hegseth for a moment, protecting classified information is not optional, and no one should want a Secretary of Defense who freelances with military secrets in an open hearing. If Murphy had asked about the plane's defensive countermeasures, its communications hardening, or the specific vulnerabilities a foreign-built aircraft might carry, classification would be the obviously correct answer. But that's not what happened. Murphy was asking what the retrofit would cost taxpayers, and separately, whether that cost would ever be disclosed. Neither question requires revealing how the plane is protected. This is where classified risks becoming something other than a security designation, a general-purpose exit whenever a question gets politically inconvenient. And that risk isn't hypothetical here. Other senators in the same and related hearings ran into similar walls asking about contract costs and delivery timelines, with Pentagon officials saying that kind of information simply cannot be revealed in this setting, or is not for public consumption language that sounds procedural but functions, in practice, as a stop sign for oversight. Bring the administration's own logic into this. If the White House believes accepting and modifying this aircraft is a defensible decision, then someone in the administration should be able to make the public case for it. Why is a new aircraft necessary? Why should taxpayers fund the conversion? What's the ceiling on that spending? What happens to the aircraft afterward? Who signed off? None of those require breaching classification. They require someone willing to explain a decision that's already been made. The fair criticism here isn't about Hegseth as a person, it's about performance in the role. A defense secretary walking into a budget, hearing about a program this well-known, this well-reported, should walk in prepared for the obvious question, not classified specs. The obvious question: what did this cost, and will you tell us? Instead, what came across looked less like command of the issue and more like someone searching for the safest possible exit from an uncomfortable line of questioning. That distinction matters because of what these hearings are actually for. Cabinet secretaries don't appear before Congress as a formality, they appear because Congress appropriates the money they spend, and appropriation without explanation isn't oversight, it's a rubber stamp. Which leads to the line worth ending this block on. Accountability is not an attack on national security. Sometimes it's just someone asking, plainly, where the money went. If the cost question was uncomfortable, the next one was worse because it wasn't really about money anymore. It was about who ends up owning what the money bought. Murphy's follow-up centered on the aircraft's future. Air Force officials had already testified that the retrofitted plane likely wouldn't be delivered until 28 months before the end of Trump's term. Murphy asked the natural next question: what happens to the aircraft after that? Specifically, could it end up going to Trump personally, potentially even to his presidential library, once he leaves office? This is the kind of question that doesn't require a law degree to understand. If a taxpayer-funded program converts a Qatar-gifted aircraft into a functioning Air Force One, and that plane is barely in service before the presidency ends, the public has an obvious interest in knowing who benefits from that spending afterward. Not because the answer is assumed to be scandalous, because the absence of an answer is its own kind of information. This is where the analysis has to be careful. Nothing here proves misconduct. Suspicion is not evidence. But the discomfort in the room wasn't manufactured by Murphy. It came from the gap between a very large public expenditure and a very thin public explanation of where that expenditure ultimately lands. It also raises a broader question about the job itself. A Secretary of Defense serves under the president, but his obligation isn't to shield the president from uncomfortable arithmetic. His obligation runs to the Department of Defense, to federal law, to Congress, and to the taxpayers funding the department he runs. Put plainly, his job is not to protect Donald Trump from an awkward question. His job is to protect the interests of the United States, which in this case includes making sure a billion-dollar range program isn't quietly repurposed into a private benefit without anyone having to explain it. None of the individual questions here were unreasonable. Who approved the current arrangement? What determines where the plane ends up? What protects the public's interest in an asset it paid to build? Is there anything in writing? What, in the end, does the taxpayer actually get for the money? They were asking what a very expensive program costs, whether that cost will ever be public, and who ends up holding the asset once the retrofit is finished and the term is over. Those are not radical questions. They're the baseline of what oversight is supposed to look like. So here's the conclusion, and it's meant to land with restraint rather than theater. The issue isn't whether Pete Hegseth enjoyed being questioned by Chris Murphy. Almost nobody enjoys that. The issue is whether he was prepared to answer the questions that come standard with being Secretary of Defense, and on this exchange, the honest answer is that he wasn't, or chose not to be. Either way, the audience just watched a legitimate test of command over the office. The answers given did not pass it convincingly.